Welcome to Land's End, the most westerly point in all of England. Situated at the very tip of Cornwall, and at least 874 miles from John o' Groats, all the way up in the far north of Scotland, Land's End has for years been the starting or ending point for epic voyages that traverse the length of Great Britain. And it's typically this very point which marks the beginning or conclusion of those monumental journeys. This is the modern Land's End signpost, which displays the distance from this point in Cornwall to John o' Groats, as well as to the city of New York, just 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, which looks absolutely pristine on this beautiful summer's evening, as we gaze out over the cliffs here at Land's End. The scenery here at the very end of Cornwall is absolutely spectacular, and on this walk we'll stroll alongside the cliffs, gaze out over the ocean, and even get a glimpse at the Isles of Scilly from afar. But when it comes to iconic images in Land's End, it's here in front of the iconic signpost where everybody really wants to get that souvenir picture. Every day, hundreds of visitors patiently queue to get a picture with the Land's End signpost. But you might notice that there are actually two posts here. One which reads with the current year, 2023, and then a much older post which stands atop a stone base, which is the original Land's End signpost, first erected back in 1957 by a local family who owned the land here. Initially, the family offered visitors the chance to stand beside the signpost and have their photo taken for a small fee. And more than 60 years later, that same business remains in operation. Although nowadays, you can also have the name of your hometown and the distance to it added to the signpost when you get an official photograph. If you come later in the day, you can use your own camera to take a picture with the much sought after signpost for free if you fancy, while the late afternoon also allows you to enjoy the serenity of this truly beautiful part of the country when the busiest crowds of tourists have gone home for the day. There's so much more to a visit to Land's End than simply seeing the signpost, as this famous geographical extremity is also home to a wealth of captivating heritage, just one piece of which we find here. This white house is known as Penwith House, and it's one of the oldest buildings at Land's End, as it was opened back in 1860 as a temperance hotel for Victorian-era tourists, a kind of pub where no alcohol was served. Temperance hotels were increasingly popular around the country during the Victorian era, as was the trend of visiting Land's End, with the very first tour groups coming to this westernmost point of England in the second half of the 19th century. Now home to houses, beacons and much more, mass tourism over the last 150 years has transformed what was once upon a time a wild piece of Cornish coastline into a kind of village of its own, complete with an array of intriguing landmarks, most of which can claim to be the most westerly of their kind in the whole country. This, for example, is the so-called First and Last Postbox in England, and for a long time it was popular to send a postcard from Land's End here back home, or to friends and family around the country. Although, as we can see, the country's westernmost postbox is sadly no longer in use. But no matter, because there are plenty more things to see and do in Land's End, with shops, a large hotel, a pub, and plenty of modern attractions. But before we have a look at all of that, let's take a walk along the coastline, towards the oldest building in Land's End, the so-called First and Last House. The First and Last House, which we can see just in the distance, stands a little closer to the most westerly piece of land in England, that being the small rocky headland that it stands on top of, which juts out a few feet further into the Atlantic than the site of the famous signpost. That headland is known as Dr. Syntax's Head, named after a popular cartoon character of the 19th century, who travelled around the country in search of the most beautiful rural scenes. And of course, the natural beauty of Land's End is one of the reasons that so many people have flocked here over the years, this windswept piece of coastline having long been a symbol of being as far removed from the modern, built-up world as possible. But while this place may seem extremely isolated, According to local legend, out there in the water there lie the ruins of an ancient sunken kingdom, a grand civilization that once stood at the very edge of Great Britain. The kingdom was known as Lyonesse, and it's said that it spanned a huge area stretching from here all the way to the Scilly Isles, home to a number of towns, as many as 140 churches, and vast plains of fertile green land. As we can see now though, there's no such magical kingdom just off the coast of Land's End, because it's said that Lyonesse was sunken by a freak tidal wave around the time of the late 11th century, a catastrophic event that sent shockwaves across the land. The entire kingdom was inundated, possibly in the space of just one terrifying night. But legend has it that one man survived the disaster, a man by the name of Trevelyan, who was riding a white horse that galloped away from the waves, up onto the mainland here, and then deep into the Cornish countryside. Now of course, the tale of Lyonesse, Trevelyan, and the rest is more than likely fictional, but it's a rich piece of local folklore which endures to this day. Many Cornish fishermen even say that on calm days out at sea, you can still hear the bells of Lyonesse's sunken churches ringing from beneath the water. But here we've stumbled across a building which certainly isn't fictional, the First and Last House, which is the oldest building at Land's End. Originally built in the early 19th century, the house was used as a souvenir shop run by a woman named Gracie Thomas, who would provide refreshments to weary travellers as they reached Land's End, and offer stamps allowing tourists to show that they'd visited the most westerly point in all of England. The First and Last House was the very first building constructed at Land's End, but as Dr. Syntax's head here is rather small, most of the tourist facilities that we can see in the distance were later built on a flatter, wider area of land just slightly to the east. What that means though is that when you visit Land's End, you must remember to make your way to the First and Last House, in front of which there stands a Cornish flag, flying proudly over what is the most westerly point on the English mainland. This iconic flag, known officially as St. Piran's flag, is a famous symbol of Cornwall, this part of Great Britain home to its own distinct identity, having existed more than 1,000 years ago as its own independent kingdom. The early medieval history of Cornwall is a riveting, albeit rather complex one, but in the modern day Cornwall is an area where you'll see many expressions of national pride, Cornish flags in prominent locations like this being just one example. In its shadow is the First and Last House, still used to serve refreshments as it has been for the past 200 years, and still offering some of the most stunning views that you'll encounter in the region, with the view here to the north allowing us to marvel at nearly 5 miles of spectacular coastline, with the prominent headland known as Cape Cornwall visible in the far distance. For much of history, Cape Cornwall was actually thought to be the westernmost point in Cornwall, and therefore England, and it wasn't until the creation of the very first Ordnance Survey map in the year 1801 that Land's End here was discovered to stretch even further west. In between the two, meanwhile, are miles of imposing cliffs, dotted with caves, coves, and a few beaches and small villages where the coastline flattens out. The vast majority of Cornwall's coastline is made up of rugged cliffs and rocks, and looking inland we can see plenty of granite rock poking up above the short grasses which grow in the challenging windy conditions of this area. It's hard to understate just how lucky we've been with the weather today, because a visit to Land's End is more often than not an extremely windy one. But on calm, sunny days like this, the boundless countryside looks deeply enticing. And if you do enjoy a spot of hiking, there are plenty of walking trails that you can pick up from Land's End here. Of course, some people have even walked from Land's End all the way up to John o' Groats, an epic journey across Britain which was first undertaken back in 1871, and which today typically takes between 1 and 3 months, depending on one's route and speed. Later on, we'll talk more about the many people who've made the trip from Land's End to John o' Groats over the years, and by many different methods. But as we now make our way back from the First and Last House towards the main centre of Land's End, let's once again ponder the history of this isolated area of Cornwall, and ask ourselves exactly what was happening in Land's End in the years before tourists started coming here. With the exception of the stories of the Kingdom of Lyonesse, it would be easy to say that not a whole lot has happened here throughout recorded history. However, archaeological digs have found evidence suggesting that people have been travelling to, and even living at this westernmost point of England, for more than 10,000 years, since the Stone Age. Although for what purpose exactly, we don't know. But it wasn't until the Middle Ages that Land's End found itself on the map, first recorded in the year 997 AD under the Old English name Penwith House, which roughly translates to extreme end. It was a few more hundred years until this place came to be known by its modern name, Land's End, likely around the time of the 14th century. But at that time this area was better known for the many dangers that it posed to those on ships out in the water. As we've been walking along the coast, you might have noticed a small lighthouse just over a mile out to sea, known as Longships Lighthouse, which was built back in 1795 to warn ships of the perilous cliffs of the coastline here. The lighthouse is still in operation, because the dangers of the rocks have not gone away. In fact, there have been more than 130 shipwrecks recorded at Land's End over time, with the stretch of water between mainland Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly having historically been tough to navigate through the gales and waves of the sea. But here we've returned to the point where we started our walk, the site of the famous Land's End signpost, which stands in a beautiful location overlooking the sea and Dr. Syntax's head in the distance. Now, as we know, Land's End is the westernmost point in England. But contrary to popular belief, it isn't the westernmost point in Great Britain. In actual fact, the westernmost point on the island of Great Britain extends roughly 23 miles further west than Land's End, and you might be surprised to hear that it's located about 470 miles away in the direction that we're looking now, all the way up in the Scottish Highlands, at Corrachad Mor, a small headland just to the north of the Isle of Mull. That's a fair bit closer to John o' Groats, which is located at least 874 miles away from Land's End, as the sign reads, at least if you're making the journey overland. Because as the crow flies, it's more like 600 miles from this windswept point in Cornwall to that windswept point in Caithness. The sign also tells us that it's more than 3,000 miles to New York City from this point. Though if you were to depart from Land's End on a boat and head straight west across the pond, the first piece of land that you'd encounter would actually be only 2,000 miles away, the Canadian island of Newfoundland on the other side of the Atlantic. Before embarking on any such epic voyage, whether it be up to John o' Groats over land or to Canada over the ocean, you'd want to have a good rest. And for decades now, Land's End has offered a place for just that purpose, as this grand building overlooking the sea is the Land's End Hotel, which was opened back in the Victorian era. As we know, the Victorian period was when masses of tourists first started coming to Land's End, and so this large hotel was built to provide a place for many to stop overnight. And today you'll still find 30 luxurious rooms where you can stay for yourself at the very tip of the mainland. The hotel and its surroundings are extremely serene in the morning or late in the evening when the daytime crowds aren't around. And the views from your window, the hotel restaurant, or from the many benches just out here on top of the cliffs are truly sublime, with Longships Lighthouse clearly visible in the near distance, and the boundless expanse of ocean stretching far off towards the horizon. Looking out to sea are a selection of binoculars and a small hut that was built by the family who run the signpost business. And just behind the hut, we find an intriguing group of rocks poking out of the water. Together, these rocks are known as the Armed Knight, possibly in reference to the story that the medieval King Athelstan erected an iron rod or spire on the rocks, or on the mainland just in front of them. Though you might even say that they're some of the last visible remains of the mythical kingdom of Lyonesse, the rest of which may lie scattered beneath the water that we're looking at here. Now this area of Land's End, home to the hotel, the Signpost, Penwith House and more, is the main centre of activity in the modern day, built a short distance down from Dr. Syntax's Head on a larger, flatter headland, which is known as Dr. Johnson's Head, named after the famed writer Samuel Johnson. In a few moments we'll take a walk further inland across Dr. Johnson's Head, but here we can look out to sea once again towards the southwest. And if you're here in person, you can just about see a few islands of the Isles of Scilly on the horizon in this direction. It's not exactly visible on the camera here, but believe me, if you're here on a clear day, you can see Scilly about 30 miles away from here with the naked eye, offering a valuable glimpse at an often overlooked part of the UK. If you're in Cornwall for a bit longer, a trip to the Isles of Scilly is a popular day excursion. Boats leaving from Penzance allowing you to visit the islands, which are home to just 2,000 people, but also a wealth of beautiful landscapes, a few small villages, and plenty more. We, however, are now going to say goodbye to the coast and make our way inland across Dr. Johnson's Head, because in the modern day there's much more to Land's End than just the area that we've been exploring, with the land behind the hotel now developed into a tourist village of its own. As we know, the history of mass tourism at Land's End goes back to the 19th century, but before then there were still people coming to visit this geographical extremity. For centuries there was no First and Last House nor a hotel to provide people with a place to stay by the coast. But about a mile further inland, in the village of Sennen, a small inn was opened in the year 1620. That inn, which still exists today, is known as the First and Last Inn, and for a long time it also operated a few small facilities here by the coast. In fact, the site now occupied by the huge Land's End Hotel was once upon a time home to the stables owned by the First and Last Inn, where horses would take people between here and the inn just a mile inland. Beside where the inn's stables once stood, we now find a helicopter that formerly served as an air ambulance, saving lives across Cornwall in the many difficult-to-reach corners of this rugged part of the country. The helicopter, which has stood here at Land's End for more than 20 years now, has become a recognisable landmark for those who visit year in and year out. Though speaking of aircraft, it's also interesting to note that the Land's End Hotel was also a victim of an aerial bombing during the Second World War, sustaining severe damage from a weapon dropped by the Luftwaffe back in 1941, which also killed one man inside. Nowadays you may still see the odd plane flying around Land's End, most of which are either taking off from or landing at the nearby Land's End Airport, a small airfield which offers flights to the Isles of Scilly, as well as to the town of Newquay, and even the city of Exeter, all the way over in Devon. Planes have also been used to make the famous journey from Land's End to John o' Groats. In fact, the fastest ever journey between the 2 points took just 46 minutes and 44 seconds, achieved in a military jump jet back in 1988. Over the years there have been plenty of different ways in which people have made epic journeys between Land's End and John o' Groats. Most often the journey is made on foot, by bicycle, in a car or on public transport, but records do exist for everything from horse riding to swimming the length of Britain, as well as journeys by skateboard, by wheelchair, and even one man who walked the whole way while hitting a golf ball, setting a record for the world's longest golf hole. This Lyonesse-themed golf adventure might be a bit easier if you don't fancy 1100 miles of hitting golf balls. But if you were making the trip between Land's End and John o' Groats, say by walking, what route would you take? Well, there are plenty of different routes, but most often people follow long-distance footpaths that avoid major roads, and allow you to experience the best that Britain's scenery has to offer. From here at Land's End, it's a simple walk through Cornwall, Devon and Somerset towards the Severn Estuary near Gloucester, followed by hundreds of miles of walking north along the spine of England, through the Pennines, over the border into Scotland towards Edinburgh, and then through the staggeringly pretty Highlands towards the city of Inverness. After which point there's a footpath that'll take you all the way to John o' Groats on the very northern coast of Scotland, where you'll be greeted with a signpost and many similar landmarks to the ones you'll find here. John o' Groats is the only other place in Britain where you'll find this sign, because anybody who completes the journey between the 2 points joins an exclusive club known as the End-to-Enders, which includes everybody who's made the trip since that first voyage all the way back in 1871. In the present day, the shops, tourist attractions and more point towards Land's End being a rather recent place of fascination. And while that's true in the scope of more than 10,000 years of history, we already know that Land's End has been busy with tourists for more than 150 years now. To most of these tourists, this place is known as Land's End, but in the Cornish language, this point is known as Penwith House, which literally means the end of the land. Contrary to John o' Groats, which has a riveting story behind its name, Land's End is fairly self-explanatory. But as we've seen over the course of this walk, there's plenty of captivating history to be found at England's westernmost point. Whether you're here for the local heritage, the stunning seaside scenery, or simply to enjoy the attractions, there's plenty to make a day out to Land's End an absolute joy. And who knows, perhaps when you're here, you'll be inspired by the stories of decades of end-to-enders who've made the trip to and from this famous point in Cornwall, with the official start-finish line for the epic voyage all the way up to John o' Groats located just here. So I'll say a big thank you for watching this video, which I really hope you've enjoyed. And seeing as we're already here at the start line, I guess it's time to get going on our own epic voyage. I'll see you in John o' Groats.